The cargo ship Odyssey Dawn drifted silently through the black sea of stars, its engines humming like a heartbeat in the void. It was a routine patrol, the kind no one expected to be memorable. The crew of 9 worked quietly, checking sensors, running diagnostics, and waiting for the long hours to pass. But everything changed when the radar officer picked up a faint signal. A distress beacon coming from the edge of the debris field near the shattered moon of Varan 6. At first, they thought it was just another piece of wreckage, maybe the remains of a forgotten drone or an abandoned shuttle. Still, protocol demanded they check. As they approached, the flickering beacon revealed a small, round pod barely holding together. It was scarred, burnt, and cracked, spinning slowly in the weightless dark. When they brought it aboard, no one expected life inside. The hull hissed open, releasing a thin mist of freezing air. Inside, curled up and trembling, were 2 small creatures. They were no bigger than house cats, their sleek dark fur shimmering faintly under the lights. Their eyes glowed amber, unmistakable. The crew froze. These weren't harmless animals. They were Vralic cubs, the young of a species feared across entire star systems. The Vralics were apex predators, known for their brutal efficiency and violent instincts. Entire fleets had been lost fighting their kind. The idea of finding 2 of their young alive was both terrifying and extraordinary. The cubs hissed the moment light touched them. Tiny fangs flashed, claws extended, and a low growl vibrated from their throats. A few crew members stepped back instinctively, hands reaching for their weapons. But there was something strange in their movement. Not aggression, but desperation. Their ribs showed through their thin fur, and one limped, its small paw swollen. The smell of burnt metal and smoke clung to them. They had survived something terrible. They weren't attacking. They were defending what little strength they had left. For a moment, no one spoke. The captain ordered the containment chamber sealed, worried the cubs might be dangerous. The air on the bridge grew thick with unease. "We should send them back into space," someone whispered. "They're killers." Another voice replied, "They're just babies." The words hung in the air like static. No one wanted to admit it, but the truth was clear. These creatures were helpless. Somewhere out there, an entire warship had fallen apart, and somehow these 2 tiny lives had endured. As the crew began scanning for signs of other survivors, one of the engineers, a quiet human named Harper, stepped closer to the containment cell. The cubs pressed against the back wall, their glowing eyes locked on him. He didn't move closer, didn't speak, just knelt quietly, his expression soft. "You're safe now," he murmured, almost to himself. The others stared. "You're talking to predators," one of the crewmates scoffed. But Harper didn't care. He could see what the others couldn't, the fear trembling through their tiny bodies. They weren't monsters. They were children. When the lights dimmed for the night shift, Harper stayed near the observation window, watching as the cubs slowly curled into each other for warmth. Their tails wrapped together, their breathing shallow but steady. The hum of the ship seemed to calm them. For the first time since their rescue, they didn't hiss. They just slept. In the cold silence of space, 2 predator cubs had found something they hadn't known since their home burned: safety. The rest of the crew tried to return to their duties, but something in that small discovery stayed with them. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something had shifted aboard the Odyssey Dawn. In a galaxy ruled by fear, 2 tiny predators had reminded a crew of humans what compassion truly looked like. And though no one realized it yet, that small act of mercy would soon become a story that traveled farther than any ship ever could. The room was tense, filled with the low hum of machinery and the nervous breathing of the crew. The 2 alien cubs were locked inside a reinforced containment chamber, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Every so often, a soft growl echoed through the ship's corridors, reminding everyone what kind of creatures they had rescued. The Odyssey Dawn wasn't built for passengers, let alone predators. The situation felt like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Inside the briefing room, voices clashed like weapons. "We have to eject the pod," one officer said, slamming a hand on the table. "They're Vralic. When they grow, they'll tear through this ship like paper." Another crew member shook his head. No, we can't just throw them into space. That's murder. Someone else countered, then hand them over to the Galactic Patrol. Let them decide what to do. We don't need trouble. The debate went back and forth, louder with every passing minute, until it became less about the Cubs and more about fear. Lieutenant Harper sat quietly at the end of the table, his hands folded, listening. He had barely spoken since they brought the creatures aboard. The captain finally turned to him. "You've been silent, Harper. You found them. What do you think we should do?" The room fell still, all eyes turning toward him. Harper looked up slowly. "They're just children," he said softly. "They didn't start the war their kind fought. They didn't choose to be born predators." No one spoke for a moment. His voice wasn't angry or emotional, just calm, steady, and filled with conviction. "You're talking about one of the deadliest species in the galaxy," another officer said. "You know what the Vrolics have done? They've wiped out entire colonies." Harper nodded. "I know, but these aren't soldiers. They're scared, hungry, alone. If we treat them like monsters, that's exactly what they'll become." The captain leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You're asking me to risk every life on this ship for 2 alien cubs?" Harper met his eyes. "No, sir. I'm asking you not to let fear decide who we are." His words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. The room went silent again. Even the usual beeps of the monitors felt distant. Finally, the captain exhaled. "All right. We keep them, but under strict watch. No one goes near them without permission." The decision was made, but it didn't bring comfort. Some crew members looked relieved, others anxious. Fear lingered in their eyes, fear of the unknown, of what those small creatures might become. But beneath that fear was something else, something faint but real: curiosity. As the meeting ended, Harper stayed behind, glancing at the containment window. The cubs were awake now, their little bodies huddled together under the glow of a heater. One of them looked up, meeting his gaze through the glass. Its eyes didn't hold hatred or malice, just confusion. Harper smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "You'll be all right." That night, the crew moved cautiously through the corridors, speaking in hushed tones. Some avoided the section where the cubs were kept. Others couldn't resist sneaking glances. And in that quiet uncertainty, something began to shift. The Odyssey Dawn wasn't just carrying cargo anymore. It was carrying a test of what it meant to be human. While others saw a risk, Harper saw a chance to prove that compassion wasn't weakness. That even in a galaxy full of fear, humanity could still choose empathy. He didn't know if his belief would cost them dearly or save them all. But one thing was certain: the fate of 2 tiny creatures had just changed the course of everyone on board. The lights on the Odyssey Dawn dimmed as night mode settled over the ship. The hum of the engines softened, leaving behind an eerie quiet that filled every corridor. In the containment cell at the far end of the vessel, the 2 alien cubs crouched low, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Every sound, the creak of metal, the hiss of air vents, made them twitch and growl. They were born predators, bred to survive, but now they were just frightened children in a strange metal box. Lieutenant Harper sat outside the cell, cross-legged on the cold steel floor. His tools lay untouched beside him. He had volunteered for night watch, though no one had asked him to. The rest of the crew stayed far away. No one wanted to be near the creatures. But Harper couldn't leave them alone. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, breathing softly, letting them see he wasn't a threat. His quiet presence filled the silence in a way that words never could. Inside the cell, the cubs hissed whenever he moved. Their small bodies pressed against the wall, their tails flicking nervously. Harper didn't blame them. Everything around them, the harsh lights, the strange smells, the cold hum of the engines, must have felt like a prison. He knew fear when he saw it. He had seen it before, in soldiers, in refugees, and once in his own reflection after surviving a war. Fear was universal, no matter the species. Hours passed. The ship drifted through empty space, the stars outside unmoving. Harper barely shifted his posture. He watched as the smaller cub began to tire, its growls turning into soft, uneven breaths. The other cub, the older one perhaps, kept staring at him, its ears twitching. Harper didn't look away. He didn't try to speak. He just stayed there, calm and steady, like a quiet heartbeat the cubs could anchor to. Then, without realizing it, Harper reached into his satchel and pulled out a small blanket, an old, faded piece of fabric he used during cold shifts. Slowly, without a sound, he slid one corner of it under the containment door. The cubs froze. The older one sniffed the air cautiously, then crept closer, step by careful step. Its tiny claws tapped softly on the floor. It sniffed the blanket, then pulled it closer with its paw. The second cub joined in, curling up against it. Harper felt something shift inside him. That simple act of trust, small but enormous at the same time. In the control room, the security cameras captured everything. Crew members watching the feed went silent. "It took the blanket," one whispered. "And it's not attacking?" Another said in disbelief. No one spoke after that. They just watched as the two predator cubs, the same species that had terrified whole star systems, slowly fell asleep under a piece of human fabric. Their first peaceful rest since the crash. Harper leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't smile or celebrate. He just let out a quiet sigh of relief. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about orders or risks or what the captain would say. He was just thinking about the tiny heartbeat on the other side of the wall, fragile, scared, and alive. When morning came, the crew found him still sitting there, the blanket half pulled into the cell, the cubs still asleep. No alarms had gone off. No attacks had happened. Just silence, the kind of silence that meant peace. And for the first time since finding the pod, everyone on the Odyssey Dawn began to believe that maybe, just maybe, Harper was right. Maybe predators could be more than what they were born to be. Maybe trust could be built in the most unlikely of places, even between a human and a monster that had never known kindness. Days began to blend together aboard the Odyssey Dawn. The stars outside drifted by in endless silence, and the hum of the engines became a rhythm everyone had grown used to. But something inside the ship was different now, softer somehow. It started with one man sitting outside a cell and two frightened creatures that no longer hissed at every sound. Harper kept his quiet routine. Every morning he came to check on the cubs. He repaired the pipes and wiring near their containment chamber, humming softly as he worked. His voice wasn't strong or melodic, but it carried a calmness that filled the cold corridors with warmth. The cubs watched him every time he entered. At first they still flinched when he moved too fast, but over time the fear in their eyes began to fade. They started to associate his presence not with danger, but with comfort, with food, warmth, and safety. Harper never forced them to interact. He just kept showing up, patient and consistent, until one day, when he reached into the chamber to place a bowl of food, one of the cubs stepped forward. It sniffed his hand cautiously, then ate from the dish without retreating. The second cub followed a moment later, bumping into its sibling clumsily. Harper stayed still, a faint smile forming on his face. From that moment, everything began to change. The cubs started to respond differently. Their growls turned into low, rumbling purrs, a sound the crew had never heard before. They began to play with small pieces of cloth and tools Harper left behind. Sometimes, when he sat outside their cell fixing a panel, the cubs pressed their faces against the glass, watching him curiously. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to live again. Word spread quickly across the ship. At first, the crew didn't believe it, but one by one, curiosity won over fear. They started coming to see for themselves. First the medics, then the technicians, even the captain. Each time someone new came near, Harper was already there, his quiet presence keeping everything calm. "Just don't make sudden moves," he'd say with a small grin. "They're shy." It was strange. On a ship full of battle-trained officers, it was the mechanic with grease on his hands who had tamed the galaxy's most feared predators. The cubs' behavior continued to surprise everyone. They began to recognize faces, responding to familiar voices with small chirps or flicks of their tails. Once, during a systems check, one of the younger crew members accidentally dropped a wrench that clattered against the floor. Everyone froze, expecting a hiss or a snarl. But instead, the cubs only blinked, then went back to chasing a stray piece of fabric across their enclosure. The fear that had once filled the ship started to fade, replaced by something new: hope. People began to linger around the containment area during breaks, watching the cubs play. The captain, who had once called them a risk, started bringing small scraps of food from his own meals. Laughter began to return to the mess hall. Even the harsh hum of the engines seemed lighter somehow. The Odyssey Dawn, once a cold metal vessel drifting through space, began to feel alive again. And at the heart of it all was Harper, the man who had refused to see monsters where others saw danger. He never took credit, never gave speeches. He simply kept doing what he'd done since the first day, showing kindness. One evening, as he sat watching the cubs sleep curled together under the same blanket he'd given them days ago, he realized something. It wasn't just the cubs who had changed. The crew had changed too. Fear had turned into compassion, and suspicion into understanding. In the middle of deep space, far from any planet or sunlight, a handful of humans and two small alien predators had managed to create something rare: peace. And all it had taken was a little patience, a steady hand, and the quiet strength to care when no one else dared to. The lights on the Odyssey Dawn flickered without warning. First a blink, then darkness. The low hum of the engines sputtered, and for a moment, the ship floated in silence. Then came the alarm, sharp, piercing, echoing through every corridor. Red emergency lights bathed the metal walls, and shouts erupted over the comms. "Power failure in Sector 3! Life support offline in containment!" The crew scrambled from their stations, their boots pounding against the floor as panic spread through the ship. Harper, who had been working in the engine bay, dropped his tools and ran toward the containment area. He knew that without power, the security systems would disengage, including the electronic locks on the cub's cell. As he turned the corner, smoke from a blown conduit filled the hallway, stinging his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a technician yelled, "The creatures are loose!" The words hit Harper like a blow to the chest. He sprinted faster. When he reached the containment section, the door was already open. The glass chamber that had once held the cubs was empty. A few crew members stood frozen near the entrance, weapons drawn but trembling. "They got out," one of them said in a whisper. "We have to seal the deck." Harper ignored the order and stepped inside. The emergency lights flickered again, casting quick flashes of red across the floor. He could hear faint sounds, not growls, but small, frightened whimpers coming from under one of the tables. Slowly, Harper crouched down and looked beneath. His breath caught. The cubs were there, both of them, pressed tightly together, their golden eyes wide with fear. They weren't attacking or escaping. They were hiding. The younger one was shaking so badly its claws scraped against the floor. The older one's ears were flat, trying to shield its sibling from the noise. They looked less like predators and more like children caught in a storm. "Easy," Harper whispered. He didn't move closer yet. His voice was calm, steady, like it always was when he worked on the ship's engines. "It's all right. You're safe." The cubs watched him carefully, their breathing ragged, but something in his tone made them stay still. Slowly, Harper removed the small blanket he always carried, the same one he'd given them their first night aboard. The ship trembled as another alarm went off, but Harper barely noticed. He slid the blanket across the floor and gently draped it over their trembling bodies. One of the cubs whimpered, then pressed its head against his hand. The other followed, burying itself beneath the fabric. Harper's chest tightened, not from fear, but from something deeper, something human. He reached out and rested his palm lightly on their backs. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe here." The sound of his voice drowned out the chaos outside. When the rest of the crew finally arrived, ready for a fight, they stopped in their tracks. The sight before them was nothing like what they had imagined. Harper was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the two predator cubs curled beneath his arm, their tails flicking softly under the blanket. There was no blood, no danger, just quiet breathing and trust. For a moment, no one spoke. The alarms kept blaring, but the room felt still. The captain lowered his weapon first. "Are they—" he began, but his voice faded. Harper glanced up and nodded. "They're just scared." That simple sentence seemed to break whatever tension was left. The captain called for power to be rerouted, and engineers hurried to restore life support. The crisis wasn't over, but something had changed. By the time the lights flickered back to life and the hum of the engines returned, the cubs were fast asleep under the table, their heads resting against Harper's leg. The crew looked on silently, a mix of awe and shame in their faces. They had prepared for monsters. Instead, they had found something fragile, something that trusted a human to keep it safe. That night, when calm finally returned to the ship, Harper didn't move from his spot. The cubs stayed close, their soft breathing syncing with the hum of the engines. And for the first time since they'd been rescued, the Odyssey Dawn didn't feel like a warship anymore. It felt like a home. When the lights finally flickered back to life, the Odyssey Dawn seemed to breathe again. The hum of the engines returned, oxygen levels stabilized, and the alarms faded into a distant echo. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was reflection. No one spoke for a long time. The crew members stood scattered across the command deck, watching the surveillance footage that had automatically recorded the incident. The video looped on the main screen, showing the same moment again and again. Harper kneeling under the table, wrapping a blanket around two alien cubs who, only days ago, had been called monsters. At first, no one said anything. The usual tension that filled the bridge during emergencies was gone. Instead, there was an odd sense of stillness, as if the entire crew was seeing something they couldn't quite explain. The same soldiers who had once argued to eject the cubs into space were now staring at the screen, their expressions softened. They watched the way Harper's hand rested on the cubs' trembling backs, how their golden eyes blinked slowly before they fell asleep. It wasn't a man taming beasts. It was a human showing empathy to something that had never known it before. The captain, a man known for his strictness and logic, stood near the front of the room with his arms crossed. He had been one of the loudest voices against keeping the creatures aboard. "They're predators," he had said during the first debate. "We're inviting danger." Now he couldn't look away from the footage. His jaw clenched, not from anger but from realization. When the recording ended, he let out a slow breath. "Play it again," he ordered quietly. The footage ran once more. The same blanket, the same calm voice, the same terrified cubs finding safety in the arms of a human who should have feared them. When it ended this time, the captain turned to the crew and spoke softly, almost to himself. He reminded us what we forgot. Compassion isn't species. Specific. His words hung in the air like gravity, pulling everyone into silence again. Around the deck, heads nodded slowly. One of the medics wiped her eyes. A technician whispered, "They were scared. Just scared." And for the first time, no one argued. No one used the word dangerous. No one called them predators. The mood aboard the Odyssey Dawn shifted in a way no order could ever command. The fear that had lived in the corners of the ship dissolved, replaced by something warmer, something human. Later that day, the captain made an official announcement over the comms. His voice was steady but carried a trace of emotion that caught everyone off guard. "From this day forward," he said, "the rescued creatures from Baron 6 are not to be referred to as predators. They are part of this crew until further orders. You may call them the little ones." The message spread quickly through every corridor, every work bay, every cabin. The little ones. It was a small phrase, almost casual, but it changed everything. When people passed by the containment area now, they didn't avoid it. They slowed down, peeked inside, and sometimes even smiled. Crew members began leaving bits of fabric and small objects near the cubs' space, things to play with. The mess hall staff saved scraps of cooked meat and left them for Harper to take down. Even the ship's AI adjusted its logs, updating the official records to reflect their new name. Vralic Juveniles, protected status. The change wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, natural, like a sunrise spreading light through a long night. But it was real. The Odyssey Dawn had gone from being a vessel of survival to a place that had rediscovered its humanity. That evening, when Harper came to check on the cubs, he found the captain standing by their cell, watching them sleep. "They're safer with you than any of us," the captain said softly. Harper didn't reply. He just nodded and smiled. The two of them stood there for a while, listening to the soft rumble of the engines and the faint sound of purring from behind the glass. In the vast emptiness of space, surrounded by stars and silence, a crew of hardened explorers had remembered what it truly meant to be human, not because of victory or discovery, but because of two frightened cubs and one man who chose kindness when everyone else chose fear. Weeks turned into months aboard the Odyssey Dawn, and the ship's rhythm settled into a new kind of peace. The cubs, once small and trembling, had grown and stronger, faster and sharper, but never dangerous. They were still playful, still curious, and still followed Harper everywhere he went. No matter where he was, fixing power couplings, inspecting the engine coils, or cleaning the oxygen filters, two pairs of golden eyes were never far behind. They padded quietly across the metal floors, their tails flicking, their claws tapping softly in rhythm with his steps. When he sat to work, they curled near his boots like loyal pets, their deep rumbling purrs blending with the hum of the ship's engines. At first, the crew had been cautious. The idea of letting creatures from one of the galaxy's most feared species roam freely around a human ship felt risky. But the cubs never gave them a reason to fear. They played with tools, chased stray lights reflected off the walls, and occasionally stole Harper's gloves, only to return them later with a proud little growl, as if presenting a trophy. Soon, even the most skeptical officers found themselves smiling whenever they passed by. One of the technicians, a young man who used to avoid the containment deck entirely, began helping Harper with the cubs. He started showing them small objects, colored buttons, simple shapes, and training signals, teaching them basic commands. The cubs learned quickly. They could respond to gestures, follow directions, and even understand when they weren't supposed to touch something. Patience became the new rule of the ship, and the reward was something no one expected: friendship. Every evening, Harper would bring scraps from the kitchen, and the cubs would sit politely waiting for his signal before eating. They'd nudge his hands afterward, pressing their warm heads against his palms as if to say thank you. It wasn't long before others joined him, too. Mechanics, medics, and even navigators would stop by during their breaks, offering food or helping clean their living area. The ship that once echoed with orders and alarms now echoed with laughter and quiet purrs. The change spread beyond the ship. When Odyssey Dawn docked at a Federation outpost for repairs, word of the human with the predator cubs spread quickly. Other species came to see for themselves. Some watched from a safe distance, wide-eyed and whispering. The Vralik, after all, were feared across dozens of worlds, known as hunters, not companions. But when the cubs peeked curiously from behind Harper's leg, sniffing the air and chirping softly, even the most skeptical alien diplomats found themselves stunned. One ambassador, tall, scaled and from a species that had fought the Vralik in past wars, spoke quietly to the captain. "Humans," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "you always find a way to love what others fear." His words carried a mix of admiration and confusion. Humanity, to the rest of the galaxy, had always been unpredictable, capable of destruction, yet drawn to empathy in the most unexpected moments. The cubs became more than passengers. They became a symbol. Other ships began referring to them by name, the little ones from the dawn. They were living proof that not all predators stayed monsters when shown compassion. One night, as the ship drifted in orbit over a calm blue planet, Harper sat near the observation window, the cubs resting beside him. Their reflections shimmered against the stars, two small shapes beside one human. He reached down, scratching behind their ears, and smiled softly. Around them, the ship was quiet, the crew asleep, the stars endless. For Harper, it wasn't about taming predators or making history. It was about something simpler: understanding. He had given the cubs kindness, and in return, they had given the entire crew something far greater: a reminder of what it truly meant to be human, to care, even when no one else would. When the mission of the Odyssey Dawn finally came to an end, the ship's return to the galactic station was unlike any other. There was no parade, no medals, and no speeches, just quiet respect. The story of what had happened during their journey had already reached the station before they arrived. Officials, scientists, and representatives from many worlds gathered to see with their own eyes the impossible story everyone had been whispering about. The human crew that had lived with predator cubs and earned their trust. As the docking bay doors opened, the cubs stood beside Harper, their golden eyes scanning the crowd curiously. They had grown much since the day they were found, taller, stronger, their movements more confident. But they still stayed close to him, brushing against his legs like loyal companions. The station guards, even in full armor, stepped back instinctively. After all, these creatures were born from a species that once struck fear into entire fleets. Yet when one of the cubs looked up at Harper and made a soft chirping sound, the fear in the room melted away. It wasn't the noise of a predator. It was affection. The Galactic Council representatives were unsure at first. According to protocol, the cubs were to be transferred to a sanctuary, a protected environment where they could grow safely under observation. Harper agreed, but when the handlers arrived to take them, something unexpected happened. The cubs refused to move. They dug their claws lightly into the deck floor, hissing at anyone who came too close. Harper knelt down, placing a hand gently on each of their heads. "It's all right," he whispered. "You're safe now." His voice, calm and steady, seemed to be the only thing they trusted. Eventually, they followed him into the transport bay, but only because he walked with them. It was as if they understood that he wasn't abandoning them. He was ensuring they had a home. When they arrived at the sanctuary, a vast dome of forests and rivers under an artificial sky, the cubs hesitated at the entrance. Harper crouched again, smiling softly. "Go on," he said. "This is yours now." They looked at him for a long moment, then finally stepped forward, their tails brushing against his hands before running off into the grass. From the observation deck above, the crew of the Odyssey Dawn watched quietly. None of them spoke, but each felt the same thing: pride, sadness, and awe. They had seen the worst parts of space, battles, debris, and fear. But this moment of trust between species that were never meant to coexist, was the most powerful thing they'd ever witnessed. The story spread quickly. Within weeks, news channels across the galaxy broadcasted the footage. The human engineer who had risked his career to protect 2 alien cubs, the predators who became peaceful, and the crew who learned that kindness was stronger than instinct. People began calling it the Dawn Accord, a symbol of hope in a galaxy that had forgotten what compassion looked like. Years later, children across distant worlds would learn the story in schools. They'd hear about how a simple act of empathy had changed everything. In human colonies, murals appeared, a man kneeling beside 2 alien cubs under the light of distant stars. Some saw it as a story of peace, others as a lesson in courage. But to Harper, it was something far simpler. One evening, long after the crowd had gone, he returned to the sanctuary. The cubs, now nearly grown, had spotted him instantly. They ran to him, growling softly in recognition before pressing their heads against his hands like they always had. Harper chuckled quietly, his eyes warm. "We didn't tame you," he said softly, watching them play beneath the golden glow of the artificial sun. "We just showed you what home feels like." And somewhere deep in the stars, that truth continued to echo, not through war or conquest, but through kindness. The legacy of the Odyssey Dawn wasn't about survival. It was about connection. Proof that even in the vast cold of space, humanity's greatest strength was still its heart.